First thing we said. Just a little tipsy. Not tipsy, but like tipsy.
Yeah, that's right. He bumped it. You can straighten it out if you want. I'm trying to make sure you twist and then twist it. Testing. 1, 2, 3.
She was like the exact same. Yes, I like the same like neck shape as well as the the token women, that's right. Yeah, exactly.
All right, welcome to this session of Senior Orations. You know, some topics emerge from a text that struck a student's heart. Others from a novel read for pleasure. Still others from a discovery made during the junior author project. But occasionally, a student has been researching her thesis from the very tender years of childhood. And today we have an oration developed from one such thesis. This afternoon's orator, it seems, has never not been thinking about this question. Only recently, however, through her poring over Scripture, her study of the Fathers, her struggles with Aquinas, and finally her encounter with Pope St. John Paul II, did a worthy answer resolve itself in her mind's eye. During the next half hour, in the oration titled, Man and Woman He Created Them, Mutuality and the Role of Women in Creation and Marriage, you will vicariously reap the rewards of our orator's passion and focused research as she offers the beginnings of an answer to an age-old question. Please help me welcome this afternoon's orator, Ms. Elizabeth Shephard.
Wonderful advisor and for your patience with my multiple crises. Thank you, Professor Washington, for being my secretary. I'm Dr. Shephard. for being my third family. And to all of you for being here. It's really amazing to see you all here. I would like to begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, we just come before you now. We ask you to enlighten our minds and our hearts as we explore this topic and all the other wonderful things that the seniors are bringing forth this week. And we pray this through your blessed Mother. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death.
Father, and Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Is Christian marriage actually good for women? In other words, does marriage as described and commanded by Scripture, specifically the New Testament, truly recognize and protect feminine dignity and ability? Growing up, I spent countless hours pondering these kinds of questions. And even though I was surrounded by wonderful examples of good and healthy Catholic marriages, the words of St. Paul would ever linger in my incredulous and postmodern ears. Wives, be subject to your husbands. Nonsense, my 13-year-old self would think. I am a strong and independent woman, and I could never commit to fulfilling every whim of a mere man. Despite these outward proclamations, I clearly saw and felt drawn to the joy and the fulfillment which Christian women whom I loved and respected found in the vocation of marriage. I just struggled to reconcile them with my distaste for St. Paul's commands. And throughout high school, speaking to girls, and then during my time here, I don't believe that I was alone in this struggle. Now, I wrote my thesis in hopes of reaching a more coherent understanding of marriage as a naturally fulfilling and dignified vocation for women. In my process of reading and writing, I came to the somewhat humbling conclusion that when certain scripture passages are taken and interpreted out of context, it can seem as though the church, from its earliest days, advocated for an excessive subjection of women within marriage. However, upon further and more open-minded examination, it became clear that scripture actually protects and does not attack the dignity of women in its commands concerning marriage, exactly through emphasizing the complementarity of the roles of man and woman, or between husband and wife. So, in this oration, I will look to certain pertinent passages of the Bible in order to demonstrate that Scripture defends a framework in which a woman can come to understand and express the fullness of her feminine nature in dignity and freedom. First, I will look to the creation account given in Genesis in order to describe the fundamental equality and complementarity between man and woman. And it will be important to unfold how the relationship of our first parents could have appeared in that initial perfect state, so that we can come to a better understanding of the inherent dynamic of properly ordered marriage. Then I will move from pre to post-fall by first examining the Genesis narrative of the fall before turning to St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians. Now, as we know, the fall affected every human individual and consequently every human relationship, including or perhaps even especially marriage, right, one of the closest relationships between humans. And thus, it is incredibly important that we take our fallen natures into account when considering any commands for post-fall marriage, like those of St. Paul. It will become clear that the commands of St. Paul actually propose a way or provide a way for Christian couples to approach marriage well, even in a post-fall reality. So, first moving to Genesis. And I have my things written up here. So in the first 3 chapters of Genesis, there are several anthropological or essential truths about human nature that are made clear. And for the purpose of this oration, I will focus on 4 of these truths. So first, that it is not good for man to be alone. Second, that woman was necessary for human self-knowledge. Third, that woman perfectly completed mankind. And fourth, that man and woman are fundamentally equal. So first, in Genesis 2, in the second account of man's creation in the Bible, we are told that God looked upon Adam before the creation of Eve and said, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him." Now, with these words, God recognizes that there is something fundamentally incomplete about the solitude of man before the creation of woman. Now, there are two aspects to this solitude, and it is really helpful to make a distinction between them. So we have man, we have Adam, our first man, and the first aspect to his solitude was the solitude of man as human, right? Before the creation of Eve, Adam constituted the entirety of humanity within creation. So the solitude of man as human. And the other aspect to this solitude is the solitude of man as male, which is a direct result of the absence of woman, the absence of female. So thus, when God speaks the words about solitude, it would seem as though he is referring not simply to the solitude of man as male, but also to this more underlying, this more fundamental solitude of man as human. That it is not so much a situation of man needing woman, but of human needing human. So without this most fundamental of dynamics, this basic human relationship, obviously the further development of any kind of role remains impossible. So that was my first point, that it is bad for the first human being to be alone, and that as humans we have a fundamental need for relationship. So now my second point, that woman was necessary for human self-knowledge, women specifically. So again, we're turning to Genesis 2, to the second account of man's creation. We are told that chronologically, man was created before woman. And Pope John Paul II draws attention to the precise wording used in the relating passages when he says, and this is quote 3, "The first man, Adam, created from the dust of the ground, is defined as male in Hebrew is only after the creation of the first woman, Isa." So Adam, in other words, is presented as man, as human until the creation of Eve. And it is only within this interpersonal relationship that he is able to step fully into his role of man as male. Before Eve, he knew that he was different from and higher than the rest of the created world. But it was not until he saw Eve that he came to a full understanding of his identity. It was this beholding, this mutual beholding, right, man of woman and woman of man, that moved Adam to speak those first recorded human words. "This, at last, is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man." At last, Adam understood himself, not merely as a noble creature placed over the rest of creation, but definitively as man. He was a rational human being, yes, but in relation to women, his equal complement, his whole self, both body and soul, made sense. And this ultimate definition of humanity as being not only rational, but also actually divided into the masculine and the feminine, was only possible through a personal encounter and juxtaposition between man and woman. So now, my third point, that woman perfectly completed mankind. So, as I explained earlier, the solitude of Adam before the creation of Eve had two aspects. One related to his his human nature and basic need for relationship, and the other to the lack of woman specifically. Now, Eve perfectly fulfilled both of these deficiencies because she was both human, she was able to relate to Adam on an equal level, she was rational, had the same nobility as him, and she was also woman. She also complemented him and made him make sense. In this way, women provided both man and herself, with the ability to understand and fulfill both the shared, right, the human, and their respective, the masculine and feminine, aspects of their nature. And now 4, that man and woman were created equal. So equality in the image and likeness of God, it appears from both of the accounts of man's creation in the Bible, is fundamental between the sexes. The first account tells us how God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. There is nothing in this passage to suggest that man is essentially higher or better than woman, or vice versa. Rather, both man and woman are created equal in the image and likeness of God, each possessing the same dignity, subjectivity, and rationality. Now, the second account of man's creation tells us how Eve was formed from one of Adam's ribs. Now, notably, Adam was not an active participant in this creative process. He was in a deep sleep when Eve was brought into being. Rather, God was the exclusive creator in the case of both the man and the woman. Eve completed man. She was crafted by the same master with the same value and dignity, intentionally designed to complete the image of God in mankind. So we have our 4 points. So we have our basic foundation. And I'll now move to the pre-fall relationship between man and woman. So first I will look to how man's pre-fall state of nakedness reveals a kind of mutual and perfect knowledge of other and self. And second, I will explore how humans are naturally called to a radical self-gift. Third, I will examine how this call to self-gift is exemplified in an interaction between man and woman before the fall. So first, the idea of this perfect vision. So in the garden, we are told, man and woman constantly beheld each other in all the glorious beauty of their naked bodies. Now, while this does not necessarily mean that the first man and woman were literally naked, it does provide us with some insight into how they viewed each other and themselves. Pope John Paul II says that they're being described as both naked, and this is quote 6, quote, undoubtedly describes their state of consciousness, or even better, their reciprocal experience of the body. That is, the man's experience of the femininity that reveals itself in the nakedness of the body, and reciprocally, the analogous experience of masculinity in the woman. So, in other words, man and woman understood each other perfectly because there was no boundary to how much of or how clearly they could see each other. Now, this reality is revealed by their being described as physically naked, but extended to all other aspects of their beings. And this is because, as we know, right, humans are a composite of body and soul, and before the fall, there was no tension between these two aspects of ourselves. So, a further important implication to draw from this conclusion is that because man and woman could see and understand each other perfectly, they had a perfect understanding of themselves, their own nature and identity. That is, they understood themselves properly through their relation to each other. Now, as I explained earlier, Adam was unable to reach a full understanding of his own identity until he saw Eve. And it was only in this moment of relation that he was able to intuit and give an account of his own identity. She was taken out of man, he said. I must be man. It seems appropriate to infer that Eve had a similar experience to Adam's. That is, that she too knew and understood herself in relation to him. So now moving on to the idea of self-gift. So Abigail Favale, Catholic professor and incredible writer on femininity and gender and many other things, observed that the bodies of man and woman, quote, simultaneously proclaim our individual personhood and our capacity for relation. Now, importantly, these physical proclamations of our bodies do not indicate a merely biological reality, but include and expand beyond the capacity to procreate. So essentially, our bodies, the bodies of man and woman, claim that we have the ability to give ourselves totally in love and to receive a total gift of love in return, not just physically, but with our whole beings. Now, in Eden, this potential for self-gift was seen clearly and was carried out naturally and from a place of freedom. So, one important expression of this self-gift can be inferred from the moment when Adam first saw Eve. So, on a literal level, Adam looked at Eve and she received his gaze in return. Though brief and wordless, this moment actually reveals a really wonderful dynamic in the relationship between man and woman. So first, Adam looked at Eve and saw all of her, not just her accidents. In other words, his gaze did not stop at her body, but perceived her in her whole being. To use her in his gaze, but rather an ecstatic joy and recognition. Here at last was the perfect companion and co-worker to share equally in the human mission. Now, upon meditation, it becomes clear that Eve, too, was an active participant in this moment. Vulnerability and the acceptance of the inquiring gaze of another demands intentionality. Eve could have turned from the look of Adam, but instead she stood and she actively received it. She allowed him to understand her and to understand himself through her. It is so important to realize that woman's role of receptivity is not inferior to man's, but that it is actually equal in dignity, though different in kind. So this is the end of the pre-fall section of my talk. So now let's transition to the next part, to the fall. And so when man and woman fell from the initial perfect state to a disordered one, they lost the ability to approach each other and their relationship properly. Consequently, they also lost that full and unmarred understanding of themselves, their own nature and identity. It will become clear that the fall essentially caused a vision impairment in the minds and hearts of man and woman, with which they, and all future generations, would have to struggle. So in my effort to illuminate this tragic fall into disorder, I will look first to the precise words of the account of the fall in Genesis, before turning to a brief examination of the consequences, how man, woman, and their relationship changed. So we all know that infamous tragedy of the deceitful snake and the woman. Why not eat the apple? The snake is gently to Eve. You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like him, knowing good and evil. Innocent Eve, convinced by the serpentine soothings and the delicious appearance of the tree, took of its fruit and ate. Then she also gave some to her husband, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. Now, this opening of human eyes may not appear at first to be bad. After all, Adam and Eve could indeed see more. They knew that they were naked. However, this newfound knowledge soon reveals itself to be destructive. No longer can man look directly at woman and woman at man and see a good and perfect unlike likeness, understanding themselves through the nakedness of the other. Now, they look at each other and feel a need to cover themselves, to each hide themselves from the person who best complemented them. Instead of moving to make an uninhibited gift of self, they strive to guard themselves from misuse. There has been an essential shift in the relationship of man and woman, a movement from joyful connection and security to shame, and selfishness and pride have become present in their relationship. So, to briefly sum up kind of what we've said about Genesis so far, so that we have a coherent idea of what's going on. So, before the fall, everything which Adam and Eve had to do was required by nature. And because they could see each other and themselves clearly, they didn't struggle to fulfill these requirements. They saw what needed to be fulfilled, why it should be fulfilled, and that there really wasn't a good alternative. Now, after the fall, because their vision was skewed, they could not see clearly anymore. Consequently, although their roles and responsibilities remained consistent or engraved on their natures, they could not fulfill them with the same confident ease as before. Now, intentional self-sacrifice and toil was necessary for the completion of the respective tasks of man and woman. And so we reach a seeming impasse. And this is where I got when I was 13, that it actually seems easier to remain alone and comfortable than to enter into a difficult and only potentially fulfilling relationship. It is a huge risk to commit to loving another fallen human being when you are fallen yourself. So, do we do? No, don't panic. We take the next step. And so, in this last portion of my oration, I will turn to St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians in order to outline how Christian couples can approach marriage at a fundamental level in a post-war reality. So first, I will talk about St. Paul's command of mutual submission. Then, I'll examine his exhortation to wives, that they be subject to their husbands. And finally, I will look at his admonition to husbands, that they love their wives as their own body, as Christ loved his church. So, within his letter to the Ephesians, St. Paul opened the direct address to Christian couples with a universal principle: be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. Now, these words introduce a universal necessity to submit. They were not directed towards one individual within marriage, but rather to the spouses as a unit. By asserting that both parties are required to submit and to give of themselves before turning to one individual within marriage, the apostle again emphasized the fundamental equality of man and woman even within their marriage. So, importantly, this mutual submission was commanded out of reverence for Christ. And Pope John Paul II beautifully notes that, in quote 11, what is at issue here is a relationship with two dimensions, or on two levels, reciprocal and communitarian. One specifies and characterizes the other. The reciprocal relations of husband and wife must spring from their common relation with Christ. So, as we know, after the fall, man and woman could not see or relate to each other properly anymore. However, when Christ came and righted that balance, when he paid their unpayable debt, he provided man and woman with the potential to approach each other correctly again. Now, man and woman could look to Christ, recognize their weaknesses, and rely on him first, and thus they could enter into a relationship with the creator of their natures as the basis of their marriage. Now, this would not mean that their marriage would lack the ever-present toil, but it would greatly assist them in moving past the weaknesses of shame and pride and selfishness instilled in their natures by the fall. Now, after St. Paul spoke these words of mutual submission, he addressed the woman directly. Wives, be subject to your husbands, as to the Lord. Now, one must remember that when St. Paul speaks these words, he is not suggesting that the husband should be the absolute master or have absolute dominion over the wife. The words, as to the Lord, help to illuminate this command for us. So, when we, as Christians, submit to the Lord, we agree to follow and to obey him. But actually, most fundamentally, we accept and submit to his personal, self-sacrificial love for us and everything that it requires. Now, the submission to such love demands humility. It demands an acknowledgement that we actually can't do everything by ourselves. Further, it urges Christians to strengthen their relationship with and trust in Christ by inviting him into every aspect of their lives, even when we don't technically need assistance. And wives are challenged to submit to their husbands in an analogous way out of love for Christ. They are called to an intentional and self-sacrificial humility and receptivity to their husband's self-sacrificial love for them. As she does with the Lord, the wife is asked to constantly invite her husband to love her and to lay himself down for her in every aspect of her life, even when she would prefer to do it herself. This exhortation is not a demand for a wife to take an inferior role to her husband, but is actually a further reminder to her to look to her relationship with Christ as a model after which to form her marriage. Next, St. Paul turns to men. Quote, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." So, this love to which the husband is called is explained in terms of Christ's love for his church. Now, earlier in the book of Ephesians, St. Paul explicitly said that Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. So it is this overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of Christ, this complete pouring out of self, that the husband is called to take within his marriage. As Christ is an example of love and humility for Christians, so the husband must be for the wife. Essentially, the wife submits herself to a husband who is called to lead by laying himself down for her in love. It is this constant, reciprocal self-gift, this mutual submission, that constitutes the fulfillment of the earthly telos of human marriage. So, I would like to end my oration with an image that has stuck with me throughout the thesis oration writing process, and it is this: that the relationship between the spouses in a fallen world is like a beautiful dance. As those of you know, good dancing, it is very important that a woman allows herself to be led, and it is just as important that the man takes responsibility to lead. Like dance partners, spouses may suffer and look bad because of the defects of their partners in addition to their own failings. However, the more closely they embrace their roles and the longer they dance, the more intimate they will become, and the more beautiful their dancing will appear. Now, this self-sacrifice imitates sacrifice the defects of his church. Husbands and wives are called to a radical gift of self, which, far from diminishing their incredible dignity or value, actually emphasizes the beauty of the feminine and the masculine united. Intentionally and humbly engaged in their lifelong dance together, man and woman are able to encounter both themselves and each other in a profound way, which ultimately allows them to fulfill their individual natures and their shared nature as they accompany each other to heaven. This full and proper understanding of marriage was what I was missing at 13. Properly ordered Christian marriage is not an entrapment or servitude of women. Rather, it establishes a dynamic union in which the totality of womanhood is revealed and cherished. Approached in this naturally proper manner, Christian marriage is indeed good for women. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ms. Shephard, for an inspiring oration. And having already been, Dr. Schubert, would you like to begin?
Can you explain misogyny to me? We're talking about the vision that is compared to post-fall.
Mm-hmm.
A vision of perfect equality and unity.
Mm-hmm.
If that's the case, equality and unity, right, is the case. But why is it that we see in a post-fallen world the oppression of women?
Yeah.
Right. Presumably, if men and women were equal, and then they have. Couldn't women oppress men? Just as well, but and maybe women have and do, oppressed men. But the greater right, social issue, right, is the question of women by men, right? And I wonder why the dynamic goes that way if there is fundamental equality between the sexes. Doesn't that just possibly point to a kind of a fundamental natural inequality between the sexes?
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, there are multiple ways to kind of go out that question, but just kind of scripturally, I talked about with Dr. Al how, so right, there is this fundamental kind of giving of the man and receiving of the woman, and within the garden, I think, right, Adam was still required to lead well, but Eve was just absolutely kind of open to that and able to respond to that perfectly. And he was also absolutely open to her relationship. But after the fall, kind of in the moment of the fall, right, Eve kind of turned her motion of self-gift to Adam to actually a selfish reaching. Like she was reaching for knowledge that was undue to her and undue to him, right? And so disordered kind of her own like perfectly ordered relationship to Adam. And then also Adam, his proper role of leadership, right? What was the snake doing in the garden? Like, couldn't he have been there? Why wasn't he there with Eve in that moment? Sorry? In the moment of the fall.
The text is ambiguous. It says she
Milton
gave it to her.
In Milton Except.
She gave it to her husband, who was with her.
Who was with her?
But that phrase could be taken to mean who happened to be in the garden but wasn't next to her, or it could be who was standing next to her and did nothing.
And either way, he took the fruit off her and ate it. So right, and we're not told that there's a fall until after Adam eats the fruit. So it seems as though there is kind of like this position of leadership or head that Adam is holding that maybe he could have benefited from some way. So I don't know. There's this. So this perfect leadership, this beautiful leadership of Adam, and this ability to be led well by Eve was both abdicated in that moment. So it was seen that this leadership is then turned from this positive thing, a mutually beneficial thing, to a negative thing, and both kind of right. We see that Eve, in one of the curses, is that she's going to long for that loving gaze of Adam, but your husband will rule over you. You'll long for the love of your husband, but your husband will rule over you. So it seems as though this is just like an ongoing curse that we, especially men, I think, have to realize and recognize and really work to return to that self-sacrificial leadership and laying down of self for women. But I don't know. Does that kind of...
Yeah, it sounds like you're saying misogyny is a perversion of the Edenic order, which involved male leadership.
Yes. And yeah.
Yeah. Can you help me understand how this male leadership, which is self-sacrificing, is any different than the universal call to all Christians to take up their cross and follow after Christ and love as Christ loves? It's unclear to me, right, how there's a sort of uniquely like masculine way to do the Jesus love thing.
Yeah, okay. This is something that I've been thinking about a lot and talking about a lot. And I think outside of marriage, it's really difficult to talk about. At least I don't think that wasn't a good point. I'm talking about masculine leadership outside of marriage. But within marriage, it is a very prudential thing. I mean, the way that this is going to be manifested, like this fundamental dynamic of giving and receiving is going to be manifested, is going to differ a lot. I mean, there's going to be some couples where I'm sure the woman will take more of the leadership role sometimes, and it will fluctuate more, but
That's
I don't know. Does that kind of start? So as long as, so we need, all I'm arguing for basically is that we need this fundamental giving and receiving, this fundamental gaze and reception of the gaze.
But the man gives and the woman receives. It doesn't go the other way. Women don't give, men don't receive love.
No, I think that it does go the other way, absolutely. But this kind of absolutely fundamental kind of role of the male, even like, we can just say this physically, right? Like the woman will receive something from the man, and she will multiply it, she will nurture and she will cherish it, and she will give it back to him as a child, right? That seems to be the role of the woman, to take something that the man is offering her and to beautify it and nurture it and then give it back to him. So it is just like this constant cycle of love, it seems, or this cycle of self-gift. So I'm not saying that a man cannot feel love or a woman like cannot give, like that would be incorrect to say.
Yeah, maybe I'm not understanding like the word leadership in this context. I don't understand what that means. Okay. I can understand dance to a certain extent. But yeah, I don't really know leadership.
Well,
And if it's
within
just-
marriage,
Sorry, I was just saying, right, if it's self-sacrificing, then again, that just sounds like being Jesus.
so are you looking for like a practical example?
I don't know, maybe you could do, yeah.
So, okay, well, again, this is going to be a prudential thing. It's going to look different, I think, in every marriage, but going off of the marriage that I've had most experience with, which is my parents, we move a lot, and the process of moving is always like a very integrated, long conversational process, but it is actually usually my dad who makes the final decision, and mum will eventually just kind of agree to that, even though there, of course, there'll be this huge leading up this conversation. But I mean, I wonder if in another marriage, maybe it's this idea of leadership and submission is carried out a lot more literally, like a husband would literally just make a decision to move and the wife would be okay with submitting instantly. I think that, I don't know, the role of leadership of a husband is a role of really working out what is going to be the best for his wife, first of all, and himself and their children, what is going to be the most beneficial and the most likely to lead them all to heaven, and then acting based upon that. And it is him who has the ultimate responsibility, I think, to constantly be directing his family in their journey towards heaven. And I think that that's kind of the leadership. Of course, like the woman, right? She's there to nurture, she's there to love and to form and to assist in all these different ways. But the kind of ultimate leadership role is left with man. I don't know if that helps at all.
I have a lot more questions, but.
Yeah, well, let me go a follow-up question on that one. Could a husband and wife, when they get married, could they decide, you know what? Here's how it works. The wife's the head. So, you know, we agree. That's how it is. The husband, your job is to be submissive to your wife and to love her and be obedient to her as you are obedient to Christ and the church. And wife, your job is to lay yourself down for your husband. And there you go. Is that something that's sort of up to deliberation? Like, can we vote on that?
I do not think so.
Okay.
I wonder if that could really work for anybody. I don't know. We kind of see this. Well, Pope John Paul II talks about in Mulieris Dignitatem how the physical ability, right, because we are a composite of body and soul, the physical ability of women to gestate, right, and to give birth and to nurture children actually informs her soul in this really beautiful way, to where she is able to nurture and form society in a very unique way. So that's just an example, right, of there seems to be a kind of objective feminine role or situation or nature, and to just kind of decide, well, actually, no, now you're going to take the totally masculine role. But again, I don't want to say that a particular example couldn't work, right? Because for some couples, it works so well for the mom to be the breadwinner, to be the breadwinner, and that is how that couple works, and it works really well for them. And that is not to say that this still is kind of fundamental dynamic of self-gift and receptivity, that constant cycle, is being abdicated in any way. It's just that perhaps the particular manifestation of it, particular way we're carrying it out, is different in a specific instance.
Sure. So, yeah, so again, as I'm trying to think about headship, and we're going to distinguish it from sort of societal role in some sense, right? You say, no, so look, the wife could be the one that's working full-time, and the husband could be the one that's doing the dishes and making the chicken Kiev or whatever the case may be, right? And yeah, that's right, yeah, that's right. And figuring in a nice apron and all of that. we're saying, but even if that was the shift we did, that wouldn't be a shift in terms of whatever we mean by this headship. Is that right?
It's fundamental kind of.
So the headship means something else other than, say, gendered societal roles?
I wouldn't say, but it does not. Wait, so what you're saying is that it is saying something different than gender?
Well, I'm just asking here, yeah, so because you seem to say, like, look, the couple, any given couple could decide for, she's the breadwinner and he stays at home, she's the one that does X, he's the one that does Y. But then you're saying this isn't subject to change, so then there must be something.
What is that?
What is this
Yeah, what is the
thing
thing?
that is
Yeah,
not,
that's what we're-
they can all decide to do these other stuff, but this thing they can't change. What's this
Yeah.
thing that is headship?
Yeah, no, I still think that it's something to do with our human natures. It's something to do with our masculine and feminine natures. So there's something about the masculine that is meant to be the leader or the head of the wife, of the wife within marriage. And even though particular manifestations of this could change, I don't think that should change or it can change. And maybe if it wasn't present or something like that, if this fundamental dynamic wasn't present, then I don't think it would really be a Christian marriage.
Sure,
I
sure.
don't know.
So when we talk about, and ask about this then, help me better understand what we mean by active receptivity. Those human, Aristotle, like, oh, we talk about the active passivity. Aristotle, like, what? Like, what is this phrase we're talking about?
Well, it's not like Adam is just working on Eve or something like that, or like,
Sure.
I don't know. It's right. He's not just like acting on her. She has to receive his action. Because I don't know, right? Man and woman are two complete individuals with their own rationality and ability and all these different things. And so if he just kind of forced himself on her in a certain way, there wouldn't be kind of that mutual relationship going on. Like she has to accept him in a properly ordered situation, right? She has to accept him. And she has to kind of, I don't know, like want that and want to know him in return. Want to be able to see herself through him as well. Don't you think? I think that it would be really problematic to say that Eve is just the passive one in a relationship.
Yeah.
It's really
That's right. So I'm trying to figure out then how we're, again, it's the qualifying of this that is always the, like, so I'm fundamentally sympathetic. This is not me disagreeing with this. We just try to like think through what are we saying here as a result, right? That when we're saying, hey, in fact, when we qualify this, let me give it concrete. So, for example, the mutual submission. When we talk about qualified mutual, we're saying there's headship, but it's really mutual submission. The image I have in my mind is the man and the woman standing at an open door. Like, you go first. No, you go first. No, you go first. No, you go first. Right? No one moves in a case of mutual submission. And then I think, okay, well, someone needs to decide to go first. And so then I think, okay, are we saying that what's going on is that it's always the husband that gets to decide who goes first? Or the husband can decide who gets to go first? That's right. You know, like, where I guess when we start saying things like active receptivity or mutual submission, how does that look in terms of then saying, look, is there a first mover in this situation? Is there a person that always, by nature, the buck stops with, and everything else he does sort of, so he's not a jerk? Okay, all right, so what do we say?
I think so. Well, for the mutual submission, first of all, I think that this does not necessarily mean that each kind of man and woman are like bowing down to each, like always trying to submit their wills first or all the time. It's instead kind of just this mutual, like laying down self, like actually wanting the better for the other all the time. And this does not necessarily mean that, I don't know, you're just going to be, I don't know, standing at the door thing for ages. I don't think this means abdicating your individual roles. And as for is there always someone who chooses what's going to happen and when? I mean, no, like, right, the husband is not always the one who gets to decide what's happening. He's going to be absolutely and always sympathetic to what his wife needs and desires. And obviously that's always going to be taken into account. And in return, the wife is also going to be sympathetic with her husband's needs. I don't think that there has to kind of be this, I don't know, this if someone's assigned all the power or something like that. I think that's where the image of the dance comes in, is you both have your roles, yes, but like sometimes you're gonna like scoot your partner, like I'll sometimes like scoot my partner a little bit and be like, okay, now we're back instead. Like there's going to be this symbiotic relationship basically going on.
All right, good. I similarly have all sorts of other questions, but I'll pass it on here.
Well, we've used a little over half our Q&A time, so I think what I'd like to do is actually turn to the audience for questions, and then
I know.
Yeah. As I feel the muse, maybe I will just interrupt and
Sure,
ask my
great.
own questions, but I don't want to steal from the student paper.
You have the power.
Yeah, I
Making a joke.
Yes.
yeah. Okay.
She's letting you have it.
We agree.
We agreed beforehand.
Yeah.
Okay, so Ms. Shepherd, feel free to call.
Ronnie?
Thank you so much, Lizzie. That was a beautiful talk. So you talked about like before the fall when Adam looks at Eve and he sees her in all of her like personhood and humanity. And then you talked about after the fall how there's this kind of shame and there's not any more vulnerability in their nakedness. So where does lust play into that? Because it seems at first that shame might actually be a good thing. And so like what changes in his gaze or in their gaze when they see each other, and where does lust play into that?
You should go to Sarah's oration. It's very good. It's about vulnerability. But so basically before the fall, when Adam looked at Eve, he wasn't just looking at her as a body, right? I said that his gaze did not stop at her body, but he saw her kind of in her whole being, right? He saw her body, her soul, everything that made her up. But now after the fall, he can't see all of her anymore. So he's going to get distracted by her body. Or he has a potential right to get distracted by her body. And the whole thing of shame, I don't think shame is a good thing. Do you like the idea that we have this requirement to cover ourselves just in case we're going to be misused by somebody else? That doesn't seem like a good thing. We should be able to stand in front of someone and know that they are looking at us and listening to us as an entire human being and not just as a potential for lust or as a potential for sin, something like that.
I guess what I meant by shame was it seems like as a culture we don't have enough shame for our actions or for like the consequences of our actions. So I meant in that light, it seems like their shame is actually well placed. Or is it a different kind of shame that's not good?
That seems like a different thing. So you're talking about more like in the modern world a little bit.
Yeah, or like did they have shame because of their action, because of their sin, or they just weren't feeling like what's the difference?
Yeah, well, as I said before, right, they turn their attention from this constant self-gift and this focus on each other to something else, and like basically upset that balance that they had before. So I don't know, shame in the modern world, that's not really kind of within the scope of my thesis, but ideally, I mean, we would have stayed like in that perfect state where we would be able to see each other in their entirety at all times. And now I suppose that a certain level of at least awareness of what you're wearing and an awareness of your body, that's definitely a good thing. But I think that this kind of fundamental sense of fear that you're going to be used or that you're going to be looked at in the wrong way is not a good thing. That seems like Islam?
So in your research, have you been able to kind of get a better understanding of the reason behind a lot of young Christian women, why we think that submission means something negative? Like, did you figure out where that came from? Why we still think it now? Because, I mean, as you said,
Yeah.
you're not alone in that experience, and I've had that experience too.
Yeah. I don't know. Well, as I said towards the beginning, right, it's so easy. And certainly what I did a lot was I'd kind of be reading through St. Paul and I'd come across like the wives be subject to your husbands. I wouldn't look at the context. I wouldn't read around it or spend any time trying to understand it. I would just read it kind of from my perspective as a 21st century teenager and just be like, no, that's bad. And all the kind of voices around me, right, all the social media and everything were constantly telling me it is bad for you to submit to men. Like, do not let yourself be told that in any capacity. So I think that in order to be able to really approach these commands well, we need to approach them with belief that what Paul is saying is not fundamentally bad, or is not like fundamentally misogynistic or something like that, right? We can see throughout the letters of St. Paul that there is a kind of cultural bias towards men, but that is not the focus all the time. We need to kind of just searching for the truth, I think. I don't know. It is a really hard kind of process to go through, though, definitely.
Can I jump in on this one? As a follow-up to that question, we often say things like, nowadays it's really scary to try to live out St. Paul's. Nowadays submission seems like a scary thing. Well, don't you think it's always seemed really scary? And in fact, women have been even more frightening in a culture that allows you to beat your wife, allows you to really, in a certain way, treat her as chattel.
Yeah.
So we talk about it being scary now. Think about it in the first century when Paul is saying this. It's intensely frightening, I could imagine. And really, it seems like ever since the fall, the only really people on offer as options for marriage have been creeps, losers, and jerks. So sorry, when someone says, when St. Paul says, submit to your husband, it's like, are you serious? Is that really what you want? How could that be a good thing? So it seems like just human experience, just plain old everybody's experience of sinners is we don't need much more empirical evidence to suggest why this is so hard, right? So then the question is like, why is it plausible now? Jesus came, great. Now we can do this submission thing. Men aren't sinners anymore. Is that what it is? What makes it plausible now, where it was even more frightening when it's always been frightening? What do you think? Why is it more plausible in a post-Jesus world to submit to one's husband?
Well, both of these commandments are given in relation to Christ and as a person, and then also with his relation to the church. So Christ, as we know, right, he paid that unpayable debt. He balanced the cosmos again for us. And he provided us with this like really incredible example of just giving your entire self, of laying your entire self down again, which was not influenced by selfishness or shame or any of these other things that were the effects of the fall. So I don't know, what I really love is the idea that both the husband and the wife are called to look to their relationship with the Lord before entering into marriage. Like, this is now their primary relationship. So they're not just relying on their own strength anymore, they're actually relying on the strength of the Lord and on the strength of their relationship with the Lord in order to relate properly to each other. It's not that they don't have weaknesses anymore, but it's actually just that they have this relationship that obviously we know, right, gives us grace and also provides us with this example to see what it means to totally give yourself to somebody else in a properly ordered way without kind of any selfish flavor to it.
Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you said something about man helping women or supporting women in her mission. Is that right? Mm-hmm. Can you explain to me what is women's mission?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is the what I was talking about with Maria Stigmatata again earlier, which is the whole thing of women having this really incredible ability to form society and to cultivate society and nourish society. We actually also see this in de Tocqueville. He talks about the American society. He talks about how women have control over the mores because they are the ones raising the children and protecting or informing them in all their theological principles and everything like that. So I think that women's role in society is just the refinement, like not in a bad way, like the beautifying and cultivation of society. So.
And what, can I ask a question? Why is that specifically woman's role rather than, you said something about her nature as like the nurturer, the one who's most likely to be at home. But if that's not the case, like why is it, or if it's not always the case, how is it that can primarily be the woman's mission and not also the man's?
I think it definitely can, as we've talked about this before, of just the man can have more feminine traits or also take part in this mission. But it's the whole thing of woman's biological capacity to nurture and cultivate life is just, permeates her entire being and gives her this really unique ability to nourish society.
Thank you for that. My question is, how does a man sacrifice or lay down his life for his wife without just catering to kind of her every want and need? Because it seems like part of leadership is kind of saying, also like, okay, you need to be quiet right now so we can go here. Mm-hmm. So, I'm thinking like on the portrait. Come on, people, put your backpacks on, like we gotta go. It seems like part of leadership. So yeah, I guess how does a man also like care for his woman, but not just kind of fumble to whatever she wants?
Well, he's not abdicating his rationality or like his ability to discern a situation. Like, I don't know, he's not called to say, he's not like signing a contract in which he's like, oh yes, everything that my wife wants now. My woman, I was saying that. Everything my wife wants, now that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to lead her to get whatever she wants. Like, he is called to obviously take her desires into account when making decisions, but ultimately what he is called to do is to lead both of them to heaven, like on their mutual journey to heaven. And that does sometimes mean that he's going to have to deny his own desires and tell himself, come on, like, you can't have this, we need to get somewhere. Or it's gonna mean him saying, we've got to bypass this right now.
Okay. So then, does the wife also, part of being receptive, it would seem like, is if your husband said, okay, no, I know you're feeling this, but we have to go, is part of being the wife being receptive to sacrificing kind of your own needs and wants to follow your husband?
In as much as he's also called to that, he's also called to sacrifice his own needs.
I guess what I'm thinking is like, I think a lot of the problem that people have with the wives be subject to your husbands is like, you have to, it's like, how is my dignity going to be preserved if I'm just being completely receptive to whatever my husband wants? So how do you, I guess, protect your own dignity? I feel like that's kind of a passive aggressive way, but how do you protect your own dignity but also be passive and receptive to your husband as the leader and head?
Well, it's also, again, it's a prudential rationality. Like, the wife could still think and have conversations, obviously, with her husband, and they're doing this together. It's not just kind of these two individuals like really interacting, where they really are working as a unit, right, as this team. So there is just going to be, I think, this constant conversation about what needs, what everybody wants, and I don't think that means that the wife always has to say instantly yes to everything that husband requires. It definitely doesn't mean that. It can, he can say, I think we should do this thing, and she could reply with, well, I do not know, I don't know how to be best idea, and have this conversation. Yeah, I don't think that it's difficult because it's not going to be literal in every action. The husband and wife.
Shepherd, what do you think the impact of our transgendered world is on this question? I think isn't part of the reason this actually is a question for us, because we no longer live in a world where people look around at the stuff that has to get done and say, well, no, duh. that's what a guy does. And yeah, that's what a girl does. We don't live in that world anymore. Well, what I mean is like almost anyone could do any job, right?
Yes.
And we interact with each other furthermore digitally, right? We don't interact with each other as gendered physical bodies. We interact with each other as avatars almost, right? Especially when we're in the digital world, jumping on the societies. But isn't this in part of this crisis we seem to have somewhat because we're so separate from our bodies? And that really the only thing we look around and we see, well, the only thing I can't do is gestate a baby and I guess feed it from my own body once it's born. Otherwise, I could kind of just do everything that a girl or woman does. Likewise, a woman can look at a man and say, actually, there's nothing he does that I can't do except impregnate someone, right? So, wow. I don't know, just the retreat from bodiliness in general, does that sort of make this question become more of a crisis for us?
Sure, I'm sure it does. I mean, the retreat from that initial state of nakedness was kind of a movement away from pure and rightly ordered relationship, right? It would seem that a movement even away from our own bodies would be a further step back. Yeah, I'm not sure. I guess my initial reaction, maybe I haven't told you about this, but my initial reaction would just be that we need to start cultivating and recognizing masculinity and femininity again, and figuring out how to.
Well, let's continue our conversation after this session about exactly how to do that. Thank you.